Dr. Woods, thank you so much. I've promised Cedric here that I would assist in the Q&A, and so I have a question to kick us off, and then I would invite everyone to either drop their question in the chat, or if you're on your desktop or a mobile device where you can raise your hand, that will queue you up in the participant list, and then I will tap you to unmute. So with that, Dr. Woods, I'm wondering if we can think a little bit about restorative justice and our institution's commitment to that subject. And you and I, as well as a small group, have been thinking about ways to do that with Indigenous peoples. And something very early on that you educated me about was the significance of reciprocal actions, particularly around the concept of a land acknowledgement. And today you spoke of the land itself. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about these reciprocal actions and really what goes into having a more formalized land acknowledgement.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. That's a great question. I get emails constantly about people around the Commonwealth wanting to appropriately identify in whose traditional territory they reside, even if that native nation is no longer present in the Commonwealth or may in fact be extinct as a result of either warfare, enslavement, or disease. And I have a some people would say an overly nuanced, complex view of this, but it's not overly difficult to figure out looking at historic records, which indigenous peoples where our campus is at now. It's the people that are identified in multiple places as the Massachusetts, although some contemporary native peoples may have a different opinion and say that based on linguistic evidence that they were part of the Greater Wampanoag Confederation. Be that as it may, the sachems who were signing the deeds, albeit they were not paid until 50 years later for what was the Shawmut Peninsula and environs, were tied to the praying town of Ponkapog. So that's not hard. But before you weigh into doing those kinds of things, it's far more important to focus on having a relationship with those communities to make that assertion. Because for me, that's exactly what it means. When I make that acknowledgement, I'm also acknowledging that I have a commitment to that community. I'm acknowledging that I am a guest. I'm an indigenous person, but I'm a guest in somebody else's territory. If they go to North Carolina to Lumbee country, they'll be a guest in my territory. And so those obligations are incurred. And I think that's what it means to go down that particular path. And it's something that should be discussed and negotiated very explicitly and directly with the Native community for it to be meaningful.
Thank you. I think that's one of the takeaways from the time I've spent with you is the meaningfulness of really engaging in difficult conversations to understand the historical context and to understand that actions really have to be done from a place of deep investment in the community and honoring the past as well as building a joint relationship for the future. So I appreciate that. I see I have a hand here from Diane, and then folks are dropping things in the chat. So I'll get to the chat next, but let's first go to Diane and again, open the floor up. So if you can raise your hand, great. If not, the chat, and then I'll also just open the floor up if we exhaust all of those if you can't raise your hand. Diane?
I was actually going to defer to the people in the chat first, if you'd like.
Oh, all right. All right, so we've got a comment here from Deb, mentioned a workforce program for Indigenous people. She was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that and any career resources in particular for this population.
Sure. So what I was referencing is just as municipalities, community action agencies can apply for and get WIOA funding to run a workforce development program, there are American Indian specific dollars for that as well. And the entity that has those monies and has a program which our Native students certainly can access is located at the North American Indian Center of Boston in Jamaica Plain. So whatever the WIOA programs are doing elsewhere, they're also doing it there, but for a particular clientele population. And they're also very much aware of other resources that our Native students may be able to access. Not just the tuition waiver, there's any number of ongoing revisions of list of scholarships for American Indian students. They can help them develop a resume, some of the same things that our career centers here may do, but they'll also have direct connections with tribes, potentially in terms of either intern or even employment opportunities as well. So all of those things are possibilities.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Rachel, who I want to acknowledge from OSLICE as one of the planners for today. So thank you so much, Rachel, for all of your time in helping to get us to today. Rachel would like to know if you could speak a little bit more about what it means for Native people and their political affiliations versus racial and ethnic identities.
It's a great question, Rachel. And I referenced it very briefly about treaties. And treaties are bilateral political agreements entered into by indigenous peoples and various European powers. I also presage that by referencing indigenous peoples as diplomats, meaning that indigenous peoples also had agreements amongst themselves as to how to engage in proper protocol, conduct, relationships, recognition of territorial boundaries. And so those treaties are actually the ones between tribes like Rachel's nation, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, in the United States. They're instruments of international law and have standing in international law. And so these treaties are still valid in the US, and tribes frequently spend a lot of time litigating to protect their rights under these various treaties. And in a treaty, a tribe frequently would cede a portion of their homelands for guaranteed protections of reserved homelands for themselves. Or even if they ceded a portion of a homeland, they may have reserved hunting and fishing rights in those areas. And so those are things that indigenous peoples continually have to battle to maintain and to protect. Even like here in the Massachusetts, the Mashpee and several other the Wampanoag bands have been involved in litigation off and on for over a century around fishing rights. Fishing rights guaranteed in agreements with the English, later by the Commonwealth, but still they end up in court on an ongoing basis, even though they have these agreements that guarantee the ongoing exercise of these rights. And what it means as well, one slide I didn't include is, well, who gets to decide who's a Native person? And it's not based on amount of Indian blood, it's based on citizenship. And each tribe gets to decide what that means. For some communities, they are still strictly matrilineal or patrilineal, meaning that their belonging to that community is tied to their mother or their father's line. Other tribes, can be bilateral. It can be from either the father or the mother's line. Some tribes have adopted blood quantum criteria, which I see it as problematic from from numerous perspectives. One being that if you follow it close enough, you're either all going to end up marrying very close relatives from your same tribe, because marrying another tribe doesn't count in terms of the blood quantum, and also you will disappear. So both of those things can happen. But so for Native peoples in determining citizenship, for a growing number of Native peoples, it's about a political expression and political belonging, just as those of us who live in Massachusetts are viewed as citizens of the Commonwealth. I'm a citizen of the Lumbee Indian Tribe of North Carolina. As such, it means that I have access to certain avenues of political participation, i.e. I fill out the paperwork, I can get an absentee ballot. I can speak at a tribal council meeting. if I were living in territory, I could serve on tribal committees. I could participate in programs operated by the tribe for members of the tribe. So there's that piece of it. But then outside of my tribal territory and outside my citizenship as a citizen of the Lumbee Indian Tribe of North Carolina, there's also the ethnic classification of indigenous peoples, which is much broader and not tied to those political expressions of rights. And so the level of organization of Native nations is extremely variable. And as I mentioned earlier, the level of access to different types of or protections of certain kinds of rights is highly variable depending upon the status of their particular tribal nation. Rachel, I think I may have gotten at most of that, maybe not. I know you certainly can weigh in as well if you'd like to.
No, that's exactly it. Because that was really helpful. Because I think some people will think that being a member or a citizen of a nation is their racial or ethnic identity, and so I think you made a really good distinction between that. Those are different things. That was really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
And if I can, before I follow up with Diane here, Cedric, I think this sort of is an adjacent question to what you and Rachel were just talking about, but language is really important here. And this is one question that came in. We've heard several different terms as sort of high-level terms referring to this group: First Nation, Native, Indigenous. And I'm wondering, is there particular significance to that? Does that tie back to citizenship and ethnic identity, or is that sort of more interchangeable based on personal preference?
Yes, to all of the above. So there are some certain generational divides, if you will. And I won't say divides, I'll say transition points. I'm over 50 now. People 50 and older, and particularly those who work with a lot of census documents and historic records, still will use and continue to use American Indian, Alaskan Native, based on the terms we grew up with, but also based on the degree of specificity of those particular terms. Indigenous is a much broader category. Inuit people are indigenous, Métis people are indigenous, First Nations people are indigenous. But they are three distinct political classifications in Canada. And don't call any of them Indians. They hate that term up there. In the US, people my age and older, it's not a big deal. Native people in the US younger than me generally tend to prefer Native American or Indigenous. The best thing is to ask someone what they prefer to be called. And the most absolute best thing is, if you know their tribal national identification, that should be how you refer to them, because that's actually what tells you who they are. It tells you where they're from. It tells you who their kin are. So if anybody asks me, well, what are you? I rarely say I'm an American Indian or I'm Indigenous. I always say I'm Lumbee. And if you don't know who the Lumbee are, this is who my people are. This is what defines me.
Great, thank you. So let's go to Diane. And if there are any others who would like to raise their hand, feel free to. I'm watching the participant list and also the chat. Diane?
Thank you, Mike. Dr. Woods, thank you very much. As a Lumbee, could you speak a little bit to your experience in higher education in general and other institutions? You referenced that you had been at other places before UMass Boston, and I'd just be interested, again, as a Lumbee, what your experience has been like, and if you want to get specific and compare to UMass Boston, that's great as well.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share stories. So I graduated high school in 1987 and attended UNC Chapel Hill. When I was applying to that wonderful, highly regarded academic institution, I had to check other. because American Indian Alaskan Native was not an option on their application for admission. I took great exception to that, given that I was from the largest state recognized tribe in the state. So if the state recognized that we were there and obviously still around, why did our formal documents applying for admission to our state university not reflect that? So being an advocacy activist minded individual from a family with similar leanings, it was one of the first things I got involved in when I arrived on campus, was to change the application, and they did, you know, to their credit. I guess I was surprised that it took until 1987 that they did so, because they now also something about North Carolina. North Carolina is very much part of the Jim Crow South, or was when Jim Crow was still legally enforced, and that they did not knowingly admit Lumbee students until 1969. They knew that there were Lumbees being admitted after that point, but still did not give us the opportunity to identify as American Indian on that campus and in that space. So those things played a role. There were also 0 out of 2,000 faculty, 0 American Indian Alaskan Native faculty on that campus when I started there. So that was something else that I engaged with. We're looking to develop a collaborative relationship with the administration around, and they realized that, well, given we have the highest Native population east of the Mississippi, maybe we could find a Native faculty person or two. Now they have 14. So universities, if there's an institutional will and a partnership, can move forward and do positive things. But it was not an easy place for me to be. I grew up as a result of Jim Crow South. Native communities, particularly at Lumbee, were hyper concentrated, even though it wasn't a formal reservation. In the town I grew up in, about 2,000 people. There may have been, excluding university students, 200 non-Lumbee people in the entire town. And I could drive you from where I grew up out in 10 miles, show you that there were portions I was related to everybody for 5 miles on both sides of the road. That's also how heavily intermarried we are. But it was driven by us not being able to go to other schools. So we all had to live to where Indian schools were at, because they integrated the schools in 1971. My sisters went to segregated schools. So that's part of the history of that particular place. Then I went to the University of Arizona at Tucson, and the very reason I went there is because of their large number of Native faculty and large number of Native students and Native support programs. Vine Deloria Jr. was still there, although he was transitioning to University of Colorado at that point in time. Tom Home, David Wilkins, Jay Stouse, later Chanina Loma-Wema joined the faculty there, Mary Jo Tippecanoe Fox. So a lot of Native people that I had heard about and knew about and had interacted or engaged with, or my dad had in particular. And so for me, it was a compelling place to be. And there were 500 Native undergrads and 200 Native graduate students there. So I was not fond of being in the extreme minority as I was at Chapel Hill. So it was a great place, an important place for me to be successful in my master's program. University of Connecticut, much more like Chapel Hill in terms of, well, actually worse. Fewer Native students at University of Connecticut, less support for Native students. But I was working full-time while I got my PhD, so I had a great advisor that I worked with, so I had different needs when I was there. I didn't need the same kind of community support. I worked for a tribe and with tribal people 40 hours a week, and then did school 20 hours a week. So different needs. But U of A was certainly the gateway to me being able to be successful in graduate education in a way that Chapel Hill couldn't have been at that point in time. It could be now, but it couldn't have been then. And UConn still wouldn't be if I were there in a master's program. So that's been a little bit of my experience in navigation through higher education. It was far more important for me being at UConn, getting my PhD, even though not a native person, Robert B., professor emeritus from their anthropology department, but highly regarded in Native communities for the work he did around tribal governance. And so that was the support mechanism I needed to be successful. Did I answer that, Diane?
Sorry, muted. Yes, you did. You did. Thank you. And I'm sure that we will look forward to hearing more on that as well when the next session, when we talk more of the higher ed context. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, Shelley's worked for public and private institutions, and then her own personal experience as a Native graduate student and undergrad student. She certainly can bring a lot to the table.
I guess my only follow-up question is, were you surprised at each step of the way with this? Did you go into something expecting one thing? Like UConn, I would have thought by that point, I mean, I'm sort of guesstimating time, would have been a little more awareness, especially given the history of Connecticut in terms of connection to Native peoples. And so I'm a little surprised, but did you go into these situations with different expectations, or at that point in your life, was it just sort of, this is what I've come to expect, and I know I'm going to have to advocate to get, no matter what?
Yeah, Diane, when I went to UConn, I had no illusions as to what it was. I had coworkers who had graduated from there and knew that the state had an ambivalent at best and frequently antagonistic relationship with the tribes. So I had no expectation it was going to be a supportive place. So I was looking for the right faculty people, and I found them. So I was very fortunate in that regard. But in terms of it having a welcoming, engaging, supportive Native community supporting Native students, wasn't happening, didn't expect it. But that's really not the place you want an institution to be in.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I think this is a good point to make just a small footnote that education has long had a history in the United States of a relationship with oppression and cultural, really misappropriation for Native populations. And there's a great documentary offered by PBS. Cedric and I have talked about this, and I'll drop it in the chat. It's called Unspoken America's Native American Boarding Schools. And so a legacy of really just terrible, terrible oppression and operation of federal Indian boarding schools. So it's really important that we think about our role in public higher education as having a connection to this legacy. And so that's why it's so important that we are doing this today. And we'll continue in our next session unpacking what it means to be practitioners in the education setting. Let me now go to Dr. Santoro. I see, Kim, your hand up, and then Kareem, I see yours as well. Kim? And let me unmute you there we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woods. I'm here as a staff over at the Counseling Center. I'm currently the director there, and I'm also very much a clinician there. And I see several of my colleagues here as well. My question for you is probably an unfair one, because I know you can't speak to the experience of all Native and Indigenous persons. But with that said, in your personal experience, your research, your studies, tied to this importance of language, what advice might you have for clinicians who are working with students who identify as Indigenous or have tribal affiliations, that is also respectful of how mental health is constructed, maybe in your experience or in your tribe? I'm aware that the way that we talk about mental health and psychiatric difficulties can be very clinical sounding. I'm aware that there's different cultural formulations about these concepts, and I'm just curious to hear more of your response to that.
Sure. A colleague of mine who I work with on a BSAS grant, Jackie Vorpal. She's Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and a clinical psychologist. And I love the way that she positions it. I mean, she does this formal explanation of historical trauma. But at the end of the day, you know, it spins around about connection and being seen and being heard. And if you can do those things for Native students and help them connect with other Native people in Native community, it's critically important. I mean, it was really hard for me at Chapel Hill because I was on a campus with, I think at that point in time, 20,000 plus students, and there were 200 Native students, which sounds like a lot, but 200 in a context of 20,000, we were very few and far between. So we had to make an effort to find one another and make an effort to have a space for one another. So it was really good for me and healthy for me to connect with people from some of the local, the local tribe near the campus. So I could get out in the landscape there and connect with that place. And so connection to place, I think, is important for Native student health and well-being, and that can be hard to do in an urban setting. So I think that that's something that if I was going to say a to-do list would be to make sure that you have a good understanding of where to refer people to. Just like even at Native American Lifelines, they have an active Red Road sobriety meeting and group that meets. So you may have Native students that are part of the recovery community, and here's a culturally specific resource. And if they're coming in like I am from someplace else, they're not going to know it exists. So I think that's an important thing, to be able to make those kind of referrals. Or Mass Center for Native American Awareness has the best powwow and Native event list anywhere. So to be able to say to them, check this out. If you're feeling lonely, homesick, here's a way to reconnect with other Native people. And you'd be surprised, Kimberly, again, one of my high school, she's a couple of years behind me, but we were in high school together. She's Lumbee as well, lives in Dorchester. So here's somebody that I know her family. We can talk and share and make the homesickness a little easier to deal with, just by knowing where to look.
So I see we have Kareem, your hand up, and then there's also a hand without a person that's raised, and I'm not sure whose hand that is. So if your hand is up, but you're not Kareem, please let me know in the chat who you are so that I can make sure that you're unmuted. And I think that'll probably be our last two questions. Kareem.
Thank you. Hey, Cedric, how are you? Good to see you, my friend.
I'm good,
Cedric,
buddy. I missed lunch.
Yeah, me too. Cedric, can you explained your journey as far as education? Can you inform us of your journey to UMass Boston, and more importantly, what has kept you with us for so long? Because you know, you're a very special person, and it takes somebody very special to be here for so long, and especially of what you do for the Native communities here in our area.
Well, that's an excellent question, Kareem. So what brought me to UMass Boston? Well, I worked prior to being at UMass for the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation for 12.5 years, and did a whole 5 different jobs working for the same tribal nation. One of those jobs, I was the director of their career development program. And one of my employees was John Peters Jr., also known as Jim, who's the executive director for the Mass Commission on Indian Affairs. And after he left my employ and became the executive director at the Mass Commission, they managed to round up some money from the Kellogg Foundation to start the Institute. And they chose UMass Boston. They could have put it at any UMass school or anywhere they wanted to. They chose UMass Boston for 2 reasons. One, geography. Boston is the central part of the regional hub of all the federal agencies and programs that are required to work with tribes. So that was something that was in our favor. And the second one was that UMass was viewed as having a commitment to community engagement. And so that's why the Institute was placed there. And then they faced the issue of they had money and they had a university who was willing to work with them and no director. And at that point in time, I had just finished my PhD and took a buyout from Mashantucket because I knew that I wanted to actually use that PhD in academia. And Jim called me up and said, "Hey, do you want a job?" And I was brought in on an interim basis and a formal search was done, but they decided that I hadn't done anything too horrible and decided to keep me around, and have stuck around because of my commitment to the work and the relationship with the communities. I did my dissertation research partially with the Mashpee Wampanoag as well as the Mashantucket Pequot. So those are communities that my research interest tied me to as well. And I've stuck around because even though it has been very challenging at times, I enjoy 99% of the people that I work with, and again, a deep connection to this place and to both the campus community and the indigenous communities.
So with that, thank you, Kareem, for that question. Thank you to everyone for your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Diane in just a minute to wrap us up. But Dr. Woods, if I can, just one more question that I think would be helpful for us to sort of wrap up today. You started your talk thinking about a little bit about iconography and symbolism and sort of the representation of indigenous peoples. And one of the things that has been a part of our conversation is, as a state institution, the use of the state seal and symbol here on campus. And now knowing that there is an official state resolution that is up on Beacon Hill, which has established a special commission to study and hopefully replace the state seal and motto, I'm wondering if there's any sort of insider information you have or anything you'd like to share about that process and what that would mean for Native peoples, knowing that there is a particularly painful history associated with that symbol.
Sure, great question, Mike. And so the push to get the state seal at least reconsidered and really to get it changed has been around for 35 years. So it is not a new thing. That effort started with the late John Peters Sr., also known as Slow Turtle, who was the first executive director of the Mass Commission on Indian Affairs and medicine man for the Wampanoag Nation, and Representative Byron Rushing were the first two to get that going 35 years ago, calling for its repeal and removal. Slow Turtle has passed away, crossed over. His son now is in that position, and Byron is no longer in the state legislature, but maybe we'll see something happen. The tribal reps have been appointed. I think the governor's office and some other folks will be appointing representatives as well. But there's also a bill that has been introduced to ban Native mascots at public schools as well. And so that's something that is important to be aware of. 5 of the tribes in Massachusetts have formally signed on to that bill, calling for the removal of those mascots. And again, as a researcher, we don't have to guess what the impact is. We know. There's been 2 decades of research now talking about the impact of mascots on Native youth and on how non-Native people perceive Native peoples. So we don't have to do an opinion survey. We have hard data. Now we can choose to ignore it, but we have the information on that. So I guess I'll leave that there. But yeah, the state seal has been a source of contention, mainly as a result of the arm with the sword over the Native person. And any Native person I've had from outside of Massachusetts see that, the first question out of their mouth is, what's up with the Indian about to get his head chopped off? And it's a bloody discussion, and it's not what the heraldic conventions say it means, but it's how Native people read it. And there's historic evidence of multiple times of mass Bay colonial authorities decapitating Native leaders and putting their heads on poles or pikes.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think it's very important for us to be aware of any of the symbols that we are using. And of course, as the state looks to study and replace, certainly one thing that we can do as practitioners is think carefully about any use of the seal and de-emphasize it wherever it is not required. So thank you so much for all that you have done. Let me now turn it over to officially close us to our Assistant Vice Chancellor for Campus Services, Diane Dorigo.